Continuing my read-through of the Bible, I now come to the book of Judith. Now, the book of Judith, like the book of Tobit, which was my previous video review, is part of what Protestants call the Apocrypha and Catholics call the Deuterocanon. I talked about this in my discussion of the book of Tobit, but just to recap briefly, these are books that were part of the Greek translation of the Old Testament, or the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, known as the Septuagint. They were not, as far as we can tell, in the original Hebrew Bible, but they were part of the Greek translation, which was the version that the early church used because the early church was made up of Greek speakers, not Hebrew speakers. And so consequently, it got incorporated into the Christian Bible and remained part of the Christian Bible until the Protestant Reformation. The Protestants took these books out of the Bible because they were not originally in Hebrew, as far as we can tell, and they were not part of the Jewish canon. The Hebrews or the Jewish people had rejected these books as non-canonical, so the Protestants decided to follow the Jewish canon. And there were also, in addition to that, individual reasons for each book. So it was somewhat on a case-by-case basis as well, is my understanding. However, these books were part of the Christian Bible up until the Protestant Reformation. So Tobit and Judith and the rest of these were part of Christian culture and Christian art and Christian literature, etc. Wikipedia has a whole gallery of paintings, famous paintings from Western art history that were inspired by the book of Judith. She was a very popular figure for medieval painters. And these books are still to this day in the Catholic Bible and the Eastern Orthodox Bible. And I'm reading the Jerusalem Bible here, which is a Catholic Bible. So that's why the book of Judith is included. But if you grew up Protestant like me, then you are unfamiliar with this book. And this is my first time reading this book because I grew up Protestant. And this is my first time reading through the Catholic version of the Bible. So, the other books, I grew up religious. So the other books in the Bible, Genesis, Exodus, Judges, Joshua, I am very familiar with, but this was my first time reading this. So if you're like me, if you're maybe grew up Protestant or are not familiar with the book of Judith, maybe it would be useful if the first thing I did was to just recap what was in here. So Judith is part of what I called in my previous video, the historical fiction part of the Bible. Although it's a little bit difficult to place this in a historical setting. I'll get to that a little bit later. But it definitely reads like a novel, as with the book of Tobit, as with the book of Esther, which is going to follow this, and as with the book of Ruth. And now Ruth is placed elsewhere in the Bible, but these four books together form maybe what we could call the historical fiction part. Which means it's quite readable. Now, I'll have maybe some criticisms to say about the characterization or the plot or the message. But in terms of just pure enjoyability, like sitting down and getting immersed in a story, this is all right, as with the book of Tobit. That's not true about all of the Bible. So, for example, Genesis, as interesting as Genesis was, or Exodus, it was cobbled together from multiple different sources, and it had some rough transitions and things that didn't entirely make sense. But these books are very easy to read. You don't need any additional commentary to know what's going on, unless you want to parse the history of it. We'll get to that in a moment. And so just in terms of sheer readability, this is, in my opinion, one of the better books of the Bible. But okay, the plot. So the king of Assyria, Nebuchadnezzar, I know what you're thinking, we'll get to that later. The king of Assyria, Nebuchadnezzar, is launching a big war, and he calls on all the nations of the world to join him. And when the nations of the world don't join him, he launches a scorched earth campaign of revenge against all the nations of the world, in which he entrusts to his general Holofernes. So as part of this, the nations are either given the option to submit to the empire of Assyria or be destroyed. So then the nation of Judea is determined to resist. And Holofernes, the general-in-chief of the Assyrian army, with all the nations of the world assembled with him, comes up to besiege one of the mountain towns of Judea, a place called Bethulia. And while they're besieging it, he asks for advice on who are these Jewish people. And a guy called Achior, who is the leader of the Ammonites, replies and gives kind of a mini history of the kingdom of Judea, talking about how great and independent they are and how hard it is to defeat them when their God is on their side. The other leaders of the armies and Holofernes himself do not react well to this praising of the enemy. So they decide to hand over Achior over to the Israelites, saying, okay, if you think they're so great, then you can share in their fate. You can go into the besieged town, and then when we take the besieged town and destroy it, you can get destroyed with them. So they drop Achior off in the mountain pass in chains, all tied up. The Israelites go down to figure out who this guy who's tied up is, who has been deposited tied up, and they learn his story and they take him into their town. Now, the town is besieged, and the Israelites within the town are getting desperate because they do not have any food or water. So they call on the leaders of the town, a guy named Uzziah, to negotiate a surrender to the Assyrians. Uzziah tells them to just hold out for 5 more days. Even though they don't have any water, he says, hold out for 5 more days. If God doesn't deliver us, then we will surrender to them. And then we are introduced to the heroine of this book, Judith. So Judith is a pious widow. Her husband has died, but she is still very beautiful. And when she hears that the elders have set a 5-day time limit to surrender to the Assyrians if they're not delivered from them, she gets upset by this. She thinks this is putting God on a time limit, which she says is a not good thing to do. So she volunteers to go out to the Assyrian army. And she puts on all her feminine wiles to do so. So she put sandals on her feet, put on necklaces, bracelets, rings, earrings, and all her jewelry, and made herself beautiful enough to catch the eye of every man who saw her. So being thus dolled up, she then goes out to the Assyrian army, where everyone immediately falls in love with her. Where is it saying? They were immensely impressed by her beauty and impressed with the Israelites because of her. Who could despise a people having women like this, they kept saying. Better not leave one man of them alive. Let any go, and they would twist the whole world round their fingers. So she is meeting with Holofernes, where she portrays herself as someone who is going to be defecting from the Israelites and giving Holofernes advice on which mountain passes to take. After staying with them for a few days, Holofernes wants to sleep with her. So he has Judith over at a banquet. Judith plies him with lots of wine. So Holofernes was so enchanted with her that he drank far more wine than he had drunk on any other day of his life. Now, I've seen in some of the commentaries of this book, YouTube commentaries that I watched before filming this video and stuff I found on Google, it's often asserted that she also plied him with salty cheese in addition to the wine. I don't see that in this translation, the salty cheese part. Unless maybe I missed it or I don't remember it, but I'm looking here and I don't see it. Presumably there must be different versions of this. There's the Latin version and there's also the Greek version and who knows what else. The footnotes here in the Jerusalem Bible indicate that some of the incidents happen in different order in the Latin Vulgate. So something that happens in chapter 14 is included in chapter 13 in the Latin Vulgate. So anyways, depending on who you ask, she plied him with lots of wine and or she plied him with lots of wine and salty cheese. So he gets drunk and falls asleep in bed, and she takes out the sword and she struck twice at the nape of his neck with all her strength and cut off his head. Then she brings his head back to the town of Bethulia and announces that she has beheaded the chief of the Assyrian army. And then with the Assyrian army being now leaderless, the Jews attack the Assyrian camp. The Assyrians go to get their leader out of bed and find that their leader now has no head and are leaderless and disorderly and panic and run. And then the Jews are able to massacre them as they make their chaotic retreat. And then it ends with Israel giving thanks to God and Judith living to an old age and dying. So, yeah. I'm not sure that's the best story if I would be in charge of plotting this out, but it's readable. It's very readable. But before we get to maybe some of the narrative problems with this, let's get to the historical problems. So, if you remember anything from Sunday school, you remember that Nebuchadnezzar was not the king of the Assyrians, he was the king of the Babylonians. So right from the first verse, we have what appears to be a historical problem. It was the 12th year of Nebuchadnezzar who reigned over the Assyrians. Now, the footnote here in the Jerusalem Bible says, this translation follows the Greek, and places where the verses numbering... Oh, no. Sorry. Wrong footnote. I'm looking at footnote B. All right, sorry. Nebuchadnezzar stands for the enemy of God's people, Israel. Historically, he was the king of Babylon and was never styled king of Assyria, and Nineveh was not his capital city. So what I take that footnote to mean is Nebuchadnezzar is not the literal name of this king, but Nebuchadnezzar is just shorthand for the enemy of God's people, and we are meant to imagine that an Assyrian king is... Yeah, it's a stand-in for the name of some other Assyrian king. But then we get another historical problem here where they the Jerusalem Bible actually points out other historical problems. So Holofernes is demanding that everyone worship Nebuchadnezzar alone and compel men of every language and nationality to hail him as a god. So Nebuchadnezzar wants to be hailed as a god. The Jerusalem Bible points out the historical problem with this. Neither Assyrians nor Babylonian kings claimed divine honors. But then we get a little bit of when they're giving the history of Judea here in chapter 4, they were thoroughly alarmed at his approach and trembled for Jerusalem and the temple of the Lord their God. They had returned from captivity only a short time before, and the resettlement of the people in Judea and the reconsecration of the sacred furnishing of the altar and the temple, which had been profaned, were of recent date. So they had returned from captivity. Well, the Jews returned from the captivity in the period of the Persian Empire. And sure enough, there's a note here on the Jerusalem Bible. Historically, the return from exile and the repopulation of Jerusalem were in 539-400. Nebuchadnezzar had died in 562. Okay, so even if we accept Nebuchadnezzar as not being the actual name of the Assyrian king, I think it's, I mean, I'm not a professional historian, but I'm fairly sure that there's no way that the Assyrian Empire was attacking the kingdom of Judea during the time of the Persian Empire. During Achior's history of the Israelites as well, we also get references to them being exiled and then returned from exile. But then when they turned from the path he had marked out for them, some were exterminated in a succession of battles, others were taken captive, others were taken captive to a foreign land. The temple of their God was razed to the ground, and their towns were seized by their enemies. Then, having turned once again to their God, they came back from their places to which they had been dispersed and scattered, regained possession of Jerusalem, where they have their temple, and reoccupied the highlands which had been deserted. So yeah, that's definitely sounding like the Jews are coming back from exile. It's not sounding like the period of the Assyrian Empire. So, this is making no sense whatsoever, and there are other little details as well. Holofernes, the king of the Assyrians, the footnote notes here is the name the name of an officer under King Artaxerxes III. There are other Persian names that are in here, like Begoas, who's Begoas? He's one of Holofernes' men. Begoas, the eunuch in charge of his personal affairs. Begoas, of course, was the Persian eunuch who became associated with Alexander the Great during Alexander the Great's conquest. So there are a lot of names from different periods in history being used here, and a lot of anachronisms. So the obvious thing to conclude, I think, from this is that this is not meant to be taken as historical. And I'm going to have to take back something I said in my previous video when I was doing the introduction to Tobit, Judith, and Esther. I said that this was historical fiction in the sense that these were fictional stories taking place in recognizable historical settings. But that's the danger of making pronouncements before you've read everything. Now that I've actually read the book of Judith, I recognize now that this is very hard to place this in a recognizable historical setting because what in the world is going on here? So there are lots of different explanations for what is going on. So I think it's the view of most modern Catholics today that this is not historically accurate and it's not meant to be historically accurate. That's certainly the view of the editors of the Jerusalem Bible, who in their introduction here say these stories are not historically accurate. It's the only other I want to say scholarly, but it's for lay people. But the only other introduction to the Old Testament I've read by a Catholic, the introduction to the Old Testament by Lawrence Boat, who's a scholar but writing for a lay audience, also says that this is historical fiction with no, it didn't really happen. So I think that's the modern view, is it's supposed to be a parable or a tale meant with moral value but not historical value. But that's the modern view. Up until the 20th century, Catholic doctrine is that the Bible had to be infallible and that these books had to be really historically accurate. And then there are different explanations. One explanation is that all the names have been changed because of something. So when we see Nebuchadnezzar and we see the Assyrian army, might not be Nebuchadnezzar and it might not be the Assyrian army. The names were all changed. But it does make it hard to think of what army it would have been attacking the Israelites in the post-exilic period. And, I mean, the historical problems don't stop there. We have the town that's being besieged, Bethalah, is not attested to any other source. We don't know where it is. Certainly the story of Judith beheading the general of an approaching army, whether that was Assyrian, Babylonian, Persian, or whatever. We don't have any other sources for that story. But if you go to Wikipedia, you can go down some rabbit holes here because historically there have been lots of other explanations for how this story could be historical, but with maybe some of the names changed. Apparently the main reason it was rejected by Martin Luther and the rest of the Protestant Reformation, in addition to the fact that this was not in the Hebrew canon, was because the historical details didn't line up. So, I don't know if the implicit criticism in there is that the author of this book was just historically illiterate. If these mistakes here were just genuine mistakes. Or another explanation I read somewhere was that the author was deliberately putting in a bunch of anachronisms for whatever his purpose was, playing with the audience. You can maybe go to Wikipedia and look up some of that stuff yourself. But the point is, doesn't appear to have any historical value on the surface of it. To have any historical accuracy. Now, I mentioned earlier that this was part of the Greek translation of the Old Testament, and we don't have any Hebrew copies of it. According to Wikipedia, there is some debate about whether it was originally written in Hebrew or Greek. Apparently, some of the phrases look like they might have originated in Hebrew first and then been translated over into Greek, although, according to Wikipedia, there's also debate about that. But at any rate, if it was originally written in Hebrew, that original Hebrew copy did not survive. We just have the Greek copy, which was, again, part of the Septuagint. A popular explanation for this is apparently it was written during the time of the Seleucid oppression. So, like during the era of the Maccabees and the Hasmonean kingdom, when the Jews were fighting for independence against the Greek-speaking kingdom of Seleucia. And there was a resurgence of nationalism going on during that time. And so this was kind of a nationalistic story to boost the morale or remind the Jewish people about how they had defeated foreign invaders before. Again, I'm not a scholar, so take everything I say with a grain of salt, but that certainly seems to make a lot of sense to me because this is definitely seems to be a nationalistic book. So there are a couple histories of the Israelites here where, for example, the history that Achior the Ammonite gives, where he talks about what a great people they are and how they have defeated so many other nations. But if their nation is guiltless, my Lord would do better to abstain for fear that their Lord and God should protect them. We should then become the laughingstock of the whole world. Now, this is always given the caveat of they're successful as long as they follow their God. But the emphasis is definitely on the Israelites are going to be successful and you don't want to mess with them. So that kind of proud nationalistic drum banging does seem to pop up in this book a few different times. And if that's the background, this story strikes me as a bit odd. And I know, I mean, who am I to come in and criticize this story after it's been popular for 2,200 years? But I don't know. The whole story about Judith getting really dolled up and making herself look beautiful, and then seducing the Assyrian general and getting him to fall asleep and then cutting off his head, seems to me like if I was going to write a nationalistic story about how great my people were, I don't know if that would be the route I would take. I would say, maybe there was a really strong man and he came in and he challenged the Assyrian general to single-handed combat. And by strength of his arms, he was able to defeat him. Not like this seduction plot where you trick him into getting drunk and then you cut off his head. I don't know, it occurred to me when I was reading this story that a lot of nationalistic stories do revolve around strong women. Joan of Arc is maybe the obvious example from Western history. I've just recently come from Vietnam, where Vietnam has a tradition of female saviors of the country. So there's the Hai Bai Trung, the Hai Bai Trung twin sisters who led a rebellion against China around the time of Christ, very famous in Vietnam. There's Vo Thi Sao, who was a teenage girl who led an attack against the French forces in the 1950s, again, very famous in Vietnam. And Judith, again, before this book got taken out of the Protestant Bible, Judith and Esther were kind of looked as the strong women in the Old Testament history. But it just seems like Judith's whole thing is trading on how beautiful she is. So, okay, here's a really strong and pious woman, but, thank God she's beautiful. Because if she was ugly, then the whole plan would have just gone to smack right there. It also strikes me as a little bit strange. I don't know. I'm a little bit afraid of saying something chauvinistic, but tell me what you think here. It makes such a big deal about how pious she was, and how she had many suitors all her days from the time her husband Manasseh died and was gathered to his people. She never gave herself to another man. She's chaste, she's a widow, she's staying faithful to the memory of her husband. But at the same time, she's definitely a flirt and a tease, right? She doesn't actually sleep with the Assyrian general, but she makes him think that she is going to sleep with him by making himself look as beautiful as possible, and then getting to drink so much wine in her presence. Holofernes was so enchanted with her that he drank far more wine than he had drunk on any day of his life. So she's definitely leading him on to think that he's going to have sex with her. I don't know. It just seems to me like, okay, if we're going to do the pious woman thing, then let's be a little bit more modest. And if we're going to do the seductress thing, I don't know. What do you think? Am I being chauvinistic here? Can a pious woman also be a seductress? Wikipedia, if you look at the legacy of this book on Wikipedia, apparently there was a play produced in 1840. I want to say German, I'm going to have to go and double check this, where the author of the play kind of changed the details. And he said, the biblical Judith, I don't really have any use for her. So she goes in, she pretends to be very seductress, well, secretly she's pious, and then she cuts off his head with no second thoughts or no remorse. So apparently in his version of the play, Judith actually sleeps with Holofernes, becomes pregnant by him. She has to make some sacrifices to her purity in order to get close enough to him to cut off his head. She doesn't get to just get him to sleep with the wine. And then afterwards, apparently, she has some mixed feelings about the horror of having to cut off the head of this man. And then she goes on to carry his child. And I thought, okay, yeah, that's a bit more interesting story here. This story here, And, according to Wikipedia, it's similar to other stories like the story of Deborah and Jael killing Sisera, what was Sisera again? The Syrian general. But okay, I'm out of time.